In October 1923, railroad surveyors cutting through the remote hills of eastern Oregon made a discovery that would haunt investigators for decades. Beneath what appeared to be an abandoned church foundation, they uncovered the remains of over 300 individuals, their bones arranged in deliberate patterns that defied any known burial practice. Between 1908 and 1923, the New Eden Covenant had systematically murdered 313 souls in rituals so horrific that federal authorities sealed the records for 50 years. What the government tried to bury in bureaucratic silence can no longer remain hidden, and the truth about the Willowbrook family's reign of terror deserves to be told. Before we descend into this tale of religious fanaticism turned deadly, this story isn't for everyone. Only those brave enough to confront the darkest chapters of American religious history should continue. If you're ready to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to let these victims be forgotten, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We're building a global network of people who believe these stories must be preserved. The Willowbrook family arrived in the Oregon Territory in the spring of 1907, when Brother Ezekiel Willowbrook purchased 2,400 acres of isolated forest land for what he claimed was a revolutionary Christian community. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with piercing blue eyes and a commanding voice that could fill any building without strain, Ezekiel possessed the rare charisma that drew people to him like iron filings to a magnet. His wife, Sister Martha Willowbrook, appeared to be the perfect complement to his spiritual authority. Where Ezekiel was fire and brimstone, Martha was gentle comfort and maternal wisdom, her soft-spoken manner putting newcomers at ease while her husband outlined his vision for their souls. The couple had established their previous ministry in Colorado, where they had spent 3 years building what they called a purified Christian community. According to the testimonials they shared, their Colorado settlement had achieved remarkable spiritual breakthroughs, with members experiencing divine visions and miraculous healings on a regular basis. They spoke of a special covenant they had discovered in their biblical studies, ancient practices that the modern church had abandoned in favor of comfortable compromises with worldly values. Their followers, they claimed, had transcended the limitations of ordinary faith and achieved direct communion with divine forces. What they didn't mention to potential converts was why they had left Colorado so suddenly in the winter of 1906, or why the local sheriff had been asking questions about the whereabouts of several community members who had seemingly vanished without explanation. The official story was that God had called them to Oregon, to establish a new and even more perfect community in the pristine wilderness where they could practice their faith without interference from doubting outsiders. Ezekiel's 17-year-old son Jeremiah accompanied his parents to Oregon, a young man whose cold intelligence and systematic approach to problems had already caught his father's attention as particularly useful for the work ahead. The boy had inherited his father's height and his mother's calculating patience, but possessed neither parent's ability to project warmth or spiritual authority. Instead, Jeremiah demonstrated an unsettling fascination with anatomy and an almost scholarly interest in the mechanisms of death that would prove invaluable to the family's operations. Their 14-year-old daughter Prudence completed the core family unit, a girl who had been raised from infancy in the shadow of her parents' twisted theology. To Prudence, the practices that would horrify outsiders represented the natural order of spiritual life. She had never known a world where divine will didn't require regular sacrifice, where God's favor didn't demand the spilling of blood, where salvation didn't come through the systematic elimination of the unworthy. Her innocent acceptance of these principles made her perhaps the most disturbing member of the family, a child who could comfort frightened victims with genuine kindness even as she prepared them for slaughter. The land Ezekiel purchased sat 37 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a winding mountain road that became impassable during winter months. Dense forests of Douglas fir and western hemlock surrounded the property on all sides, creating a natural barrier that would muffle sound and conceal activities from any casual observers. A clear stream ran through the center of the land, providing fresh water and serving as a natural boundary between the residential area where community members would live and the sacred grove where the most important spiritual work would take place. Ezekiel immediately began construction on what he called the Temple of the New Covenant, a massive log structure that would serve as both church and community center. The building's design incorporated elements that seemed innocent to casual observers but served darker purposes for those who understood their true function. The altar area featured a subtle slope that would allow liquids to drain toward hidden channels, while basement chambers provided storage for items that couldn't be kept in plain sight. Soundproofing techniques, disguised as acoustic improvements for better preaching, ensured that activities within the temple would remain private regardless of their volume. The first converts arrived in late summer 1907, drawn by advertisements Ezekiel had placed in religious publications across the Pacific Northwest. He specifically targeted families facing economic hardship, recent immigrants struggling to establish themselves, and individuals who had experienced personal tragedies that left them searching for meaning. His recruitment messages promised not just spiritual fulfillment but practical support, describing a community where members would share resources and support each other through life's challenges. Among the early arrivals were the Henley family from Washington, who had lost their farm to debt and saw the new Eden Covenant as their chance to start over. Thomas Henley, his wife Rebecca, and their 3 young children brought carpentry skills and farming experience that would help establish the community's infrastructure. The Kowalski family, recent Polish immigrants who spoke limited English, arrived with their life savings and dreams of religious freedom they had never experienced in Europe. Elder widow Sarah Brennan came seeking the spiritual community she had never found in traditional churches, bringing her modest inheritance and desperate hope for belonging. These initial families found exactly what Ezekiel had promised in his advertisements. The community welcomed them with genuine warmth, providing immediate housing and food while they adjusted to their new lives. Work assignments matched their skills and abilities, creating a sense of purpose and contribution that many had never experienced. Evening gatherings featured inspiring sermons, beautiful hymn singing, and fellowship that seemed to fulfill every spiritual longing they had carried for years. But even in those early days, careful observers might have noticed subtle signs that all was not as it appeared. Certain community members seemed to hold privileged positions that had nothing to do with their practical contributions or spiritual maturity. Some families who had been enthusiastic participants suddenly became quiet and withdrawn, their children showing signs of fear that parents couldn't or wouldn't explain. Most telling of all, the community's population remained remarkably stable despite the constant arrival of new converts, suggesting that for every family that joined, another quietly disappeared. The first winter in Oregon tested the community's cohesion and revealed the true nature of Ezekiel's spiritual authority. Cut off from the outside world by impassable roads and bitter weather, community members found themselves entirely dependent on the Willowbrook family's leadership for survival. It was during this isolation that Ezekiel began introducing the advanced spiritual practices that he claimed would separate his followers from ordinary Christians and grant them direct access to divine power. May you find the courage to continue this journey with us as we uncover how a family's twisted interpretation of faith led to one of America's most systematic and carefully concealed mass murders. The weeks following the federal raid revealed evidence so extensive and horrifying that prosecutors struggled to comprehend the full scope of the Willowbrook family's crimes. Hidden chambers discovered beneath the sacred grove contained the remains of victims dating back to the community's earliest days, while sophisticated record-keeping systems documented not only murders but detailed financial accounting of profits generated from each victim's assets and processed remains. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Sarah Coleman led the excavation of the Sacred Grove burial sites, a process that would take months to complete and ultimately recover the remains of 297 individuals. Her team's meticulous work revealed evidence of systematic dismemberment, chemical processing of human remains, and burial practices designed to accelerate decomposition while concealing the true number of victims from casual discovery. The most damning evidence emerged from Jeremiah's private laboratory, where investigators found detailed medical records documenting his experiments with different killing methods and body disposal techniques. His clinical notes revealed a disturbing evolution from simple murder to sophisticated human processing operations that generated maximum profit while minimizing detection risks. The young man's scientific approach to systematic killing shocked even experienced federal investigators. Agent Blackwood's interrogation of captured recruitment network members revealed the true extent of the family's victim pipeline, with detailed records showing that over 500 individuals had been identified as potential targets during the operation's final years. This discovery indicated that the family had been planning a massive acceleration of their killing schedule, potentially doubling their annual victim count to meet ambitious financial goals. The financial investigation uncovered evidence of international connections that extended the criminal enterprise far beyond American borders. Bank records revealed regular wire transfers to accounts in Europe and South America, suggesting that the family had been preparing escape routes and establishing overseas assets in case their operations were discovered. These international dimensions added federal conspiracy charges that carry potential death penalties. Sister Martha's attempted suicide in her federal holding cell provided dramatic evidence of her recognition that the family's crimes would inevitably result in execution. Her unsuccessful attempt to hang herself with torn bedsheets demonstrated the desperation that had replaced her previously confident maternal persona. Federal guards implemented enhanced suicide watch protocols to ensure that all family members survived to face trial and potential execution. The discovery of Ezekiel's theological writings revealed the sophisticated justification system that had allowed him to maintain his self-image as a divine servant while committing systematic murder. His handwritten journals contained hundreds of pages of biblical interpretation and mystical philosophy that transformed mass murder into sacred duty. These documents provided crucial insights into the psychological mechanisms that had sustained the family's criminal activities for over a decade. Prudence's psychological evaluation revealed the most disturbing aspect of the family's crimes, as mental health professionals struggled to treat a young woman who had been conditioned from childhood to view systematic murder as normal religious practice. Her complete integration into the family's twisted ideology made her perhaps the most psychologically damaged family member, despite her youth and apparent innocence. If this systematic destruction of human life and the cold calculation behind these murders is as horrifying to you as it is to us, please share this investigation with others who need to understand how religious authority can be weaponized against vulnerable people. Hit that like button to support our efforts to preserve these crucial historical lessons, and don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into America's darkest chapters. The community's surviving members faced an agonizing process of testimony preparation as federal prosecutors built their case against the Willowbrook family. Many individuals had to confront their own complicity in activities they had believed were sacred religious practices, while others struggled with survivor guilt over their failure to recognize and prevent the systematic murders that had claimed so many lives. Emma Rodriguez's detailed testimony provided prosecutors with a minute-by-minute account of sacrifice ceremonies that corroborated physical evidence and documentary records. Her descriptions of victim preparation, ritual procedures, and disposal methods created a comprehensive picture of the family's operations that would prove impossible for defense attorneys to challenge or explain away through alternative interpretations. The investigation team's analysis of victim selection criteria revealed the calculating intelligence behind what had appeared to be random disappearances. Jeremiah's records showed that every elimination had been carefully planned based on financial assets, outside connections, and psychological profiles that predicted compliance or resistance. This systematic approach demonstrated premeditation that would support first-degree murder charges against all family members. Federal efforts to locate additional burial sites led to discoveries that extended the investigation throughout the Pacific Northwest. Ground-penetrating radar surveys identified suspicious areas on properties that the family had owned or visited, while soil analysis revealed chemical signatures consistent with human decomposition at multiple locations. These discoveries suggested that the New Eden Covenant represented only the most recent phase of the family's criminal activities. The arrest and interrogation of corrupted officials revealed a network of complicity that had protected the family's operations for years. Sheriff Patterson's detailed confession implicated judges, postal workers, bank managers, and even some federal employees who had received payments in exchange for ignoring evidence or misdirecting investigations. The scope of this corruption explained how the family had operated with impunity for so long. Jeremiah's cooperation with federal investigators provided crucial intelligence about escape plans that the family had developed in case their operations were discovered. These contingency strategies included false identity documents, overseas bank accounts, and safe houses in multiple countries where they could have continued their activities under different names. His betrayal of these plans ensured that no family members could escape justice through previously prepared channels. The psychological evaluation of community children revealed the long-term impact of their exposure to systematic violence and twisted religious indoctrination. Several children required immediate psychiatric intervention to address severe trauma symptoms, while others displayed disturbing signs of having internalized the violent ideology that had justified the murders they had witnessed. Their rehabilitation would require years of specialized treatment. Financial restitution efforts faced enormous challenges due to the systematic destruction of victim assets and the international scope of the family's money laundering operations. Federal investigators worked with international law enforcement agencies to trace and recover stolen funds, but much of the proceeds from the family's crimes had been invested in legitimate businesses or hidden in overseas accounts that proved difficult to locate and seize. The discovery of detailed architectural plans for expanded killing facilities revealed that federal intervention had prevented a massive escalation of the family's murderous activities. These documents showed designs for industrial-scale processing operations that could have eliminated hundreds of victims annually while maintaining the community's facade of religious legitimacy. The plans demonstrated that the family viewed their systematic murder operations as a growing business enterprise rather than a religious calling. Agent Blackwood's preparation for trial involved coordinating testimony from over 200 witnesses, including survivors, law enforcement officials, forensic experts, and financial investigators. The complexity of the case required months of preparation to ensure that prosecutors could present a comprehensive picture of the family's crimes while maintaining the emotional impact necessary to secure death sentences for the primary perpetrators. The trial of the Willowbrook family began on June 3, 1919, in the federal courthouse in Portland, Oregon, drawing national attention as one of the most horrific mass murder cases in American history. Federal prosecutor William Hayes presented evidence documenting the systematic murder of 313 individuals over 11 years, while defense attorneys struggled to find any strategy that could mitigate the overwhelming evidence of premeditated mass murder and financial fraud. The prosecution's opening statement outlined a criminal enterprise that had generated over $300,000 in profit from victim assets while operating under the protection of corrupted local officials. Hayes methodically presented financial records, victim testimonies, and physical evidence that painted a picture of calculated brutality disguised as religious practice. The jury's horrified reactions to crime scene photographs and forensic evidence indicated that conviction was virtually certain. Ezekiel Willowbrook's testimony in his own defense revealed the depths of his delusion and the sophisticated theological justification system that had sustained his murderous activities. His calm explanations of divine revelation and spiritual necessity horrified courtroom observers who witnessed a man completely convinced of his righteousness despite overwhelming evidence of his crimes. His inability to express remorse or acknowledge wrongdoing strengthened the prosecution's argument for death sentences. Sister Martha's breakdown during cross-examination provided the trial's most dramatic moment when she finally admitted her role in selecting and preparing victims for sacrifice. Her detailed confession revealed the psychological manipulation techniques that had made community members willing participants in their own destruction, while her obvious mental deterioration demonstrated the toll that years of systematic murder had taken even on the perpetrators themselves. Jeremiah's decision to cooperate fully with prosecutors in exchange for a life sentence rather than execution created a rift within the family that played out dramatically during the trial proceedings. His clinical testimony about killing methods, body disposal techniques, and victim selection criteria provided the jury with disturbing insights into the mechanical efficiency that had characterized the family's operations. His betrayal of his parents and sister shocked observers who witnessed the complete breakdown of family loyalty under legal pressure. Prudence's psychological evaluation became a central issue in determining her legal responsibility for crimes committed while she was a minor under her parents' complete psychological control. Expert testimony revealed that she had been systematically conditioned from early childhood to view murder as normal religious practice, raising complex questions about culpability and the possibility of rehabilitation. Her case would establish important legal precedents for prosecuting minors involved in systematic violence. The prosecution's presentation of victim impact testimony required weeks of court time as relatives of the 313 confirmed victims provided detailed accounts of their loss and the devastating impact of their family members' disappearances. These testimonials humanized the statistics and forensic evidence while demonstrating the broader social damage caused by the family's crimes. The emotional weight of this testimony visibly affected jury members and courtroom observers. Emma Rodriguez's testimony provided the most compelling eyewitness account of the family's systematic murder operations, as she described her experiences as both victim and unwilling participant in the community's practices. Her detailed descriptions of sacrifice ceremonies, victim preparation, and the psychological conditioning that made community members complicit in murder created a comprehensive picture that corroborated all other evidence presented by prosecutors. The defense team's attempts to argue religious freedom protections and diminished capacity due to genuine religious belief were systematically dismantled by the prosecution's evidence of financial motivation and calculated planning. Federal prosecutors demonstrated that the theological justifications were deliberately constructed to facilitate profitable criminal activities rather than representing sincere religious convictions. This evidence eliminated any possibility of successful religious freedom defenses. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Sarah Coleman's testimony about the systematic processing of human remains provided crucial scientific evidence that supported charges of operating a criminal enterprise rather than simply committing isolated murders. Her analysis of bone markings, chemical residues, and burial patterns revealed industrial-scale operations that had been designed for maximum efficiency and profit rather than religious purposes. The revelation of the family's international escape plans and overseas financial assets demonstrated premeditation and consciousness of guilt that undermined any claims of religious sincerity. Federal investigators presented detailed evidence of false identity documents, foreign bank accounts, and planned flight routes that had been prepared years before their arrest. This evidence of calculated preparation for escape proved that the family recognized the criminal nature of their activities. The jury's deliberation lasted only 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against Ezekiel, Martha, and Prudence Willowbrook. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the horror of crimes that had been methodically documented through physical evidence, witness testimony, and the family's own detailed records. The verdicts represented a complete vindication of the federal investigation and prosecution strategy. Judge Harrison Mueller's sentencing hearing provided an opportunity for surviving victims and community members to address the court about the impact of the family's crimes on their lives and communities. These statements revealed the long-term psychological damage caused by years of systematic deception and the challenge of rebuilding trust and faith after discovering their complicity in systematic murder. The sentences imposed reflected both the severity of the crimes and the different levels of responsibility among family members. Ezekiel received death by electric chair for his role as the operations leader and primary architect. Martha was sentenced to death for her crucial role in victim selection and psychological manipulation. Prudence received life imprisonment without possibility of parole, with the court acknowledging her youth and victimization while recognizing the severity of her crimes and the danger she posed to society. The execution of Ezekiel and Martha Willowbrook on December 15, 1920, exactly 2 years after their arrest, marked the end of one chapter in the New Eden tragedy while leaving unresolved questions about institutional failures that had allowed their crimes to continue for over a decade. Their deaths provided some measure of justice for victims' families but could not undo the systematic destruction of 313 lives or repair the damage to surviving community members. Federal investigations into the corruption network that had protected the family's operations resulted in additional prosecutions that extended well beyond Oregon. Sheriff Patterson received 20 years in federal prison, while Judge Blackwood was sentenced to 15 years for accepting bribes and obstructing justice. These convictions sent a clear message about the consequences of official corruption that enables systematic criminal activity. The dismantling of the recruitment network led to discoveries of additional criminal activities in multiple states, as investigators found evidence of fraud, kidnapping, and murder conspiracies that extended the scope of the family's crimes beyond what had been revealed during the initial investigation. These discoveries suggested that the New Eden Covenant represented only part of a larger criminal enterprise that had operated throughout the Pacific Northwest. The aftermath of the Willowbrook family's execution left the survivors of the New Eden Covenant to grapple with questions that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. How had they been so completely deceived by leaders they had trusted with their souls? How many warning signs had they ignored or rationalized away? Most painfully, how had they become unwitting accomplices in the systematic murder of 313 innocent people who had sought only spiritual community and belonging? Federal social workers spent months helping former community members rebuild their shattered lives and identities after discovering the horrific truth about their supposed spiritual paradise. Many survivors struggled with severe depression, survivor guilt, and post-traumatic stress that required years of professional treatment. The psychological damage inflicted by the family's manipulation proved as lasting and devastating as the physical violence inflicted on their victims. The 12 individuals rescued during the federal raid faced their own unique challenges as they attempted to process their narrow escape from certain death. Several required extensive medical treatment for malnutrition and drug-induced psychological damage, while others struggled with survivor guilt over their rescue when so many others had perished. Their testimonies provided crucial insights into the final stages of victim preparation and the family's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control. Prudence Willowbrook's life imprisonment became a subject of ongoing legal and ethical debate as experts struggled to understand how a young woman raised in systematic violence could be rehabilitated or whether such rehabilitation was even possible. Her case established important precedents for treating juvenile offenders involved in systematic violence while raising uncomfortable questions about the limits of human redemption and the possibility of recovery from extreme psychological conditioning. The investigation's broader implications extended far beyond the specific crimes committed at New Eden, as federal authorities recognized that the case revealed systematic vulnerabilities in the oversight of isolated religious communities. The family's ability to operate with impunity for over a decade demonstrated dangerous gaps in law enforcement coordination and the ease with which charismatic leaders could exploit religious freedom protections to conceal criminal activities. Congressional hearings convened in 1921 to examine the institutional failures that had enabled the Willowbrook family's crimes resulted in significant reforms to federal oversight of religious organizations and interstate law enforcement cooperation. These changes included mandatory reporting requirements for large financial transfers by religious organizations, enhanced coordination between federal and local law enforcement agencies, and improved training for recognizing signs of systematic abuse within isolated communities. The financial restitution process proved complex and largely unsuccessful, as most victim assets had been consumed by the family's operations or hidden in overseas accounts that proved difficult to locate and recover. Federal investigators managed to recover less than 30% of the stolen funds, leaving many victim families without compensation for their devastating losses. This failure highlighted the challenges of recovering assets from sophisticated criminal enterprises that operated across multiple jurisdictions. The New Eden property was eventually sold at federal auction, with proceeds distributed among victim families according to a formula developed by federal administrators. The buildings were demolished and the land converted to a memorial park that honored the 313 victims while serving as a permanent reminder of the dangers posed by unchecked religious authority and the vulnerability of people seeking spiritual community and belonging. Emma Rodriguez's decision to dedicate her life to helping other survivors of religious abuse created a lasting positive legacy from the tragedy. Her advocacy work helped establish support networks for individuals escaping abusive religious communities while raising public awareness about the warning signs of spiritual manipulation and systematic abuse. Her courage in testifying against the Willowbrook family inspired other survivors to come forward with their own experiences. What lessons can we draw from this horrific chapter of American history? How can we honor the memory of the 313 victims while protecting future generations from similar predators who weaponize faith against vulnerable people? Share your thoughts in the comments below about how these historical patterns continue to repeat in modern contexts, and don't forget to subscribe to support our ongoing investigations into America's hidden past. The psychological study of the Willowbrook family members provided valuable insights into the development of systematic killers and the role of religious ideology in justifying mass violence. Researchers found that the family's ability to maintain their self-image as spiritual servants while committing systematic murder revealed important information about the psychological mechanisms that enable ordinary people to participate in extraordinary evil when provided with sufficient ideological justification. The case established important legal precedents for prosecuting religious leaders who abuse their authority to commit crimes while hiding behind claims of religious freedom. Federal courts ruled that sincere religious belief could not justify criminal activity and that religious freedom protections did not extend to activities that caused physical harm to others. These precedents would prove valuable in future prosecutions of abusive religious leaders. The long-term impact on surviving community members varied dramatically based on their length of exposure to the family's manipulation and their individual psychological resilience. Some survivors successfully rebuilt their lives and found healing through therapy and supportive communities, while others never fully recovered from the trauma of discovering their unwitting complicity in systematic murder. The variation in outcomes highlighted the individualized nature of trauma recovery. The media coverage of the trial and its aftermath contributed to increased public awareness about the dangers posed by isolated religious communities that operated without effective oversight. Newspaper accounts and magazine articles helped educate the general public about warning signs of spiritual manipulation while encouraging people to maintain connections with family and friends who joined such communities. The academic study of the New Eden case contributed to the development of cult awareness and intervention strategies that would prove valuable in addressing similar situations throughout the 20th century. Researchers identified specific patterns of recruitment, isolation, and psychological conditioning that characterized abusive religious groups, providing tools for recognizing and intervening in such situations before they escalated to violence. Modern law enforcement agencies continue to study the Willowbrook case as an example of how sophisticated criminal enterprises can operate under the protection of religious freedom while systematically exploiting and murdering vulnerable individuals. The techniques used by federal investigators to penetrate the family's security measures and corruption network provide valuable lessons for contemporary investigations of similar criminal organizations. The memorial established at the former New Eden site serves as a permanent reminder that the price of religious freedom includes vigilance against those who would abuse that freedom to prey upon vulnerable people seeking spiritual community. The names of all 313 victims are inscribed on granite monuments that ensure their sacrifice will not be forgotten and their stories will continue to warn future generations. As we conclude this investigation into one of America's most systematic and carefully concealed mass murders, we must remember that the ultimate legacy of the New Eden tragedy lies not in the horror of the crimes committed but in our collective commitment to protecting vulnerable people from those who would exploit their spiritual hunger for predatory purposes. The 313 victims of the Willowbrook family deserve nothing less than our eternal vigilance against the kind of evil that masquerades as divine purpose while serving only greed, power, and the satisfaction of twisted psychological needs. Their voices, silenced by systematic murder, continue to speak through the lessons we learn from their tragic fate and our determination to ensure that such horrors never again unfold unchecked in the shadows of religious authority. The Willowbrook family's success in attracting and controlling their victims stemmed from a carefully developed system of psychological manipulation that had been refined over years of practice. Ezekiel understood that people seeking spiritual community were often fleeing from disappointment, loss, or desperation, making them particularly susceptible to promises of belonging and divine purpose. His recruitment strategy specifically targeted these vulnerabilities, offering not just religious salvation but practical solutions to immediate problems. Sister Martha's role in this process proved equally crucial, though far more subtle than her husband's dramatic preaching. While Ezekiel inspired crowds with his vision of spiritual transformation, Martha worked individually with new arrivals, learning their personal histories, family dynamics, and deepest fears. She presented herself as a confidant and spiritual mother, creating intimate bonds that made questioning the community's practices feel like betraying a beloved family member. Her gentle demeanor masked a calculating intelligence that identified which newcomers would prove most useful and which might pose potential threats. The community's daily routine reinforced these psychological bonds through a combination of exhausting physical labor, intensive group worship, and carefully controlled social interactions. Members worked from dawn to dusk on construction projects, farming, and various crafts that generated income for the community. This constant activity left little time for private reflection or questioning, while the physical exhaustion made people more susceptible to Ezekiel's increasingly intense spiritual messages during evening gatherings. Young Jeremiah's contribution to the family operation revealed itself through his systematic approach to record-keeping and logistics. The teenager maintained detailed files on every community member, tracking their financial contributions, family connections, and potential value to the organization. His meticulous documentation would later prove invaluable in planning the selection and timing of sacrificial rituals, as he could identify which disappearances would attract the least outside attention. Prudence's innocence served as perhaps the most effective tool in the family's psychological arsenal. New arrivals found it impossible to suspect sinister motives from a community where a sweet 14-year-old girl moved freely among the adults, apparently loved and protected by everyone. Her presence reassured anxious parents that the new Eden covenant was a safe place for families, while her genuine affection for community members made them lower their guard against potential dangers. The winter isolation of 1907 provided the perfect opportunity for Ezekiel to introduce what he called the deeper mysteries of the faith. During these months, cut off from outside contact, community members found themselves participating in increasingly unusual rituals that Ezekiel claimed were ancient Christian practices suppressed by corrupt modern churches. These ceremonies began with extended fasting periods that weakened participants physically and mentally, making them more susceptible to spiritual manipulation. If you're finding this exploration of religious manipulation as disturbing as we are, you're not alone in recognizing these warning signs. Share this video with anyone who might benefit from understanding how spiritual authority can be weaponized against vulnerable people. Hit that like button to help us spread awareness about these historical patterns that unfortunately continue to repeat themselves in modern contexts. The first disappearance occurred in March 1908, when the spring thaw finally made the mountain roads passable again. Thomas Henley, the carpenter who had been among the first to join the community, began questioning some of the financial arrangements and expressing concern about his family's welfare. His wife Rebecca had grown increasingly withdrawn during the winter months, while their children seemed fearful and refused to participate in certain community activities. Thomas's concerns came to Ezekiel's attention through the community's informal surveillance network, where members were encouraged to report any expressions of doubt or criticism as signs of spiritual weakness requiring intervention. Rather than address Thomas's questions directly, Ezekiel announced that the carpenter had received a divine calling to undertake a special mission in California, where he would establish a sister community and prepare the way for other new Eden members to follow. The community gathered to bid Thomas farewell on a sunny March morning, with Sister Martha leading prayers for his safe journey and successful mission. Ezekiel delivered a stirring sermon about the courage required to answer God's call, even when it meant leaving behind the comfort and security of established community life. Thomas himself seemed strangely subdued during the ceremony, speaking little and avoiding eye contact with his wife and children, who would supposedly join him once his mission was established. Rebecca Henley and her 3 children remained in the community for several more weeks, with Martha providing special attention and comfort during what she described as the natural difficulty of family separation. The children gradually stopped asking when their father would send for them, while Rebecca became increasingly involved in the community's inner circle of trusted members. By summer, she had accepted a special role in preparing other community members for their own spiritual advancement, work that required her to spend long hours in the temple's basement chambers. The pattern established with Thomas Henley's disappearance would be repeated dozens of times over the following years, with minor variations to prevent outside observers from recognizing the systematic nature of the eliminations. Sometimes entire families would receive divine callings to establish new communities in distant locations. Other times, individual members would be selected for special missions that required them to travel alone. Occasionally, members would simply vanish during the night, with explanations that they had been called away by urgent family emergencies that couldn't wait for proper farewells. The transformation of the New Eden Covenant from a religious community into a systematic killing operation required careful development of what Ezekiel termed the sacred mysteries, rituals that would justify and sanctify the murders while maintaining the loyalty of surviving members. Drawing from obscure biblical passages and ancient texts that most Christians had never encountered, he constructed a theological framework that presented human sacrifice not as murder but as the highest form of spiritual service. The sacred grove, located a quarter-mile from the main community buildings, became the focal point of these advanced practices. Ezekiel had selected this location during his initial survey of the property, recognizing that the natural amphitheater formed by ancient Douglas firs would provide both privacy and acoustic properties that would enhance the psychological impact of ceremonies conducted there. A circle of standing stones, which he claimed to have discovered on the property but had actually imported from a quarry in Idaho, created the appearance of ancient spiritual significance. Construction of the ritual site began in the summer of 1908, with community members told that they were building an outdoor chapel for special worship services during the warmer months. The project required extensive excavation to create drainage systems that Ezekiel explained were necessary to prevent flooding during Oregon's rainy season. In reality, these channels would carry away the blood from sacrificial rituals, directing it toward a concealed cistern where it would be stored for later use in the community's agricultural operations. Jeremiah took primary responsibility for the technical aspects of the sacred grove's construction, displaying an engineer's precision in calculating angles, flow rates, and structural requirements. His detailed sketches and measurements, preserved in a leather journal that investigators would later discover, revealed the methodical planning that went into every aspect of the ritual site. The 17-year-old's notes included calculations for optimal victim positioning, timing considerations for various ceremonial elements, and even weather factors that might affect the efficiency of different procedures. The first ritual sacrifice took place on the autumn equinox of 1908, with Rebecca Henley selected as the inaugural offering to christen the sacred grove. Months of psychological preparation had conditioned her to view this selection as the ultimate spiritual honor, a chance to achieve direct union with divine forces and serve as an intercessor for the entire community. Sister Martha had spent weeks counseling Rebecca about the profound spiritual transformation that awaited those chosen for this sacred duty. Community members gathered in the sacred grove as sunset approached, carrying torches that cast flickering shadows among the towering trees. Ezekiel wore ceremonial robes that he claimed had been blessed by ancient Christian mystics, while Martha led the assembled crowd in chants that combined biblical verses with phrases in languages none of them recognized. The atmosphere of reverence and spiritual anticipation masked the horror of what was about to unfold. Rebecca approached the stone altar willingly, her face serene with the conviction that she was about to experience the most sacred moment of her spiritual journey. Ezekiel's preliminary prayers lasted nearly an hour, building psychological tension while reinforcing the theological justifications for what he was about to do. He spoke of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, of Christ's sacrifice for humanity's sins, and of the ancient Hebrew temple practices that required blood offerings to maintain divine favor. The actual killing was swift and efficient, accomplished with a ceremonial blade that Jeremiah had carefully sharpened and positioned for maximum effectiveness. Ezekiel's training in anatomy, acquired through years of butchering livestock and studying medical texts, ensured that Rebekah's death was quick enough to prevent screaming that might disturb the ceremony's sacred atmosphere. The community members witnessed what they believed to be a divine transformation, as Sister Martha led them in prayers of thanksgiving for Rebekah's spiritual elevation. The psychological impact on surviving community members was exactly what Ezekiel had calculated. Rather than horror at witnessing murder, they experienced what they interpreted as profound spiritual revelation. The combination of months of theological preparation, the elaborate ceremonial setting, and the group pressure of shared participation created a collective delusion that transformed witnessing murder into a religious experience that strengthened their faith rather than challenging it. Prudence's role in these ceremonies proved particularly disturbing to later investigators who studied the community's practices. The 15-year-old girl served as what her father called the sacred witness, responsible for comforting victims during their final moments and ensuring their spiritual preparation was complete. Her genuine compassion and innocent faith made her presence reassuring to terrified victims, while her youth prevented them from recognizing the calculated nature of her participation. The disposal of Rebekah's remains followed procedures that Jeremiah had developed through extensive experimentation with animal carcasses during the previous months. The body was systematically dismantled in the sacred grove's preparation chambers, with different components serving various purposes within the community's operations. Bones were ground into fertilizer for the gardens, while other remains were processed into products that generated income through sales to unsuspecting buyers in distant markets. The three Henley children, who had watched their mother's sacrifice with the same reverent attention as the adult community members, were gradually integrated into the community's inner circle over the following months. Their acceptance of their parents' fate as divinely ordained demonstrated the effectiveness of the psychological conditioning that the Willowbrook family had perfected. By spring 1909, the children were actively participating in the preparation of other community members for their own spiritual advancement. Word of the New Eden Covenant's spiritual breakthroughs began attracting attention from religious seekers throughout the Pacific Northwest, as surviving community members wrote enthusiastic letters to friends and family members describing the profound spiritual experiences they were witnessing. These testimonials, carefully monitored and edited by Sister Martha before being sent, served as powerful recruitment tools that brought new converts to the isolated Oregon community throughout 1909 and 1910. By 1910, the Willowbrook family had refined their victim selection process into a sophisticated system that balanced spiritual justification with practical necessity. Ezekiel developed what he called the divine hierarchy of sacrifice, a theological framework that ranked community members according to their spiritual readiness for transcendence while simultaneously identifying those whose disappearance would create the least risk of outside investigation. The selection criteria prioritized individuals who had severed connections with the outside world, possessed valuable assets that could be absorbed into the community's resources, or demonstrated personality traits that might eventually threaten the family's control. New arrivals typically underwent a probationary period of 6 to 18 months during which Sister Martha conducted intensive psychological evaluations disguised as spiritual counseling sessions. Her detailed reports, written in a coded system that only family members could decipher, determined each person's ultimate fate within the community. Financial considerations played a crucial role in the selection process, though these were always presented in spiritual terms to maintain the religious facade. Community members who arrived with substantial savings, property deeds, or valuable skills were often designated as candidates for early spiritual advancement. Their assets would be donated to the community before their sacrifice, ostensibly to demonstrate their complete surrender to divine will but actually to fund the family's expanding operations. Jeremiah's role in victim selection evolved from simple record-keeping to sophisticated behavioral analysis as his understanding of human psychology developed. The 18-year-old maintained detailed observation logs on every community member, tracking sleep patterns, social interactions, expressions of doubt, and signs of potential resistance. His clinical approach to human behavior allowed him to predict which individuals might attempt to escape or contact outside authorities, making them priority candidates for elimination. The community's isolation proved invaluable in concealing the systematic nature of the disappearances from surviving members. Families selected for sacrifice were typically told they had received divine callings to establish sister communities in distant locations, with their departure ceremonies conducted with great fanfare and apparent celebration. Other community members were encouraged to view these selections as honors that demonstrated the chosen family's exceptional spiritual development. Sister Martha's maternal persona became increasingly important as the community's population turned over through the selection process. She served as a surrogate mother figure for children whose parents had been sacrificed, providing comfort and stability while gradually conditioning them to accept the community's practices as normal. Her ability to generate genuine affection from traumatized children made her perhaps the most psychologically disturbing member of the family, as she could comfort victims even as she prepared them for slaughter. The ritual calendar that governed sacrifice timing reflected Ezekiel's synthesis of Christian holidays, pagan seasonal celebrations, and practical considerations related to weather and community logistics. The autumn and spring equinoxes became the most significant ceremonial occasions, when multiple victims would be selected for group sacrifices that reinforced community solidarity through shared participation in what they believed were sacred mysteries. Individual sacrifices occurred throughout the year according to what Ezekiel presented as spontaneous divine revelations, though these were actually carefully planned events designed to eliminate specific threats or acquire particular resources. Community members learned to interpret these sudden callings as evidence of their leaders' exceptional spiritual sensitivity, never recognizing the calculated nature of the selections. The Kowalski family's elimination in spring 1911 demonstrated the refined efficiency of the selection process. The Polish immigrants had arrived with substantial savings and gold jewelry, but their limited English had prevented them from forming strong social connections within the community. Jeremiah's behavioral analysis identified them as ideal candidates because their language barrier had isolated them from other members who might question their sudden departure. Ezekiel announced that the Kowalski family had received a special divine mission to return to Poland and establish a new Eden community among their countrymen. The selection was presented as recognition of their unique qualifications for this challenging assignment, with their language skills and cultural knowledge making them irreplaceable for the work God had planned. Community members gathered to pray for their success and safe travels, never questioning why the family seemed confused and frightened during the departure ceremony. The actual elimination took place in the sacred grove 3 days after the public farewell, with the family told they were participating in a special blessing ceremony before beginning their journey. Prudence's role in comforting the 3 Kowalski children during their final moments revealed her complete psychological adaptation to the family's practices. She sang Polish lullabies that Sister Martha had taught her specifically for this occasion, providing genuine comfort to terrified children who found solace in familiar melodies even as they died. Processing the Kowalski family's remains followed the established procedures that Jeremiah had perfected over the previous year. The basement chambers beneath the temple served as a charnel house where bodies were systematically dismantled, with different components serving various purposes within the community's economy. Bones became fertilizer, flesh fed the community's livestock, and valuable items like gold teeth or jewelry were sold through intermediaries in distant cities. The family's documented assets, including their life savings and property ownership documents, were transferred to the new Eden Covenant through forged papers that Ezekiel had learned to create during his previous ministry work. These financial resources funded the community's expansion and provided the capital necessary to purchase additional land and equipment for processing increasing numbers of victims. By the end of 1911, the new Eden Covenant had eliminated 47 individuals while maintaining the appearance of a thriving religious community that attracted new converts through enthusiastic testimonials from surviving members. The systematic nature of the operations had become so refined that disappearances seemed like natural consequences of the community's exceptional spiritual success, as the most devout members were regularly called to spread their faith in distant locations. The psychological conditioning of surviving community members had reached the point where they competed for selection, viewing sacrifice as the ultimate spiritual achievement rather than recognizing it as murder. This transformation of victim mentality represented the Willowbrook family's greatest accomplishment, creating a self-perpetuating system where new arrivals were gradually conditioned by existing members who genuinely believed in the divine nature of their practices. The years 1912 through 1915 marked the height of the Willowbrook family's operations, as their killing system reached industrial efficiency while expanding beyond the confines of their isolated Oregon community. Ezekiel's growing confidence in his methods led him to establish a network of recruitment agents in major cities throughout the Pacific Northwest, creating a steady pipeline of victims who could be processed with minimal risk of detection. The recruitment network operated through a carefully constructed web of legitimate religious organizations, charitable societies, and employment agencies that served as fronts for identifying and directing vulnerable individuals toward the New Eden Covenant. Sister Martha personally trained a core group of trusted agents, teaching them to recognize the psychological profiles most suitable for their purposes while maintaining the appearance of genuine humanitarian work. In Portland, Agent Rebecca Morrison operated a boarding house for unemployed men, identifying those with no family connections or steady employment who could disappear without investigation. Her monthly reports to Sister Martha detailed each prospect's financial resources, personal history, and likelihood of compliance with community discipline. The most promising candidates received personal invitations to visit the New Eden Covenant for spiritual retreats that would supposedly help them find direction and purpose. The Seattle operation, managed by former community member Jacob Steiner, focused on recent immigrants seeking work in the lumber industry. Steiner's fluency in German and Norwegian allowed him to target European families who had few local connections and limited understanding of American legal systems. His recruiting presentations emphasized the economic opportunities available at New Eden, where families could own land and build prosperity while participating in a supportive religious community. If this systematic targeting of vulnerable populations sounds disturbingly familiar, you're recognizing patterns that unfortunately continue in various forms today. Share this investigation with anyone who works with at-risk communities, as understanding these historical methods can help identify modern predators who use similar techniques. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell to stay updated as we continue exposing these hidden chapters of American history. Agent Sarah Collins operated from San Francisco, where she managed a charitable organization that provided assistance to widows and orphans. Her position gave her access to detailed information about families facing financial crisis, allowing her to identify those who might be desperate enough to relocate to an isolated religious community in exchange for promises of security and belonging. Collins maintained meticulous records of each family's assets and vulnerabilities, forwarding detailed reports to guide the Willowbrook family's recruitment decisions. The efficiency of this expanded network allowed the New Eden Covenant to process victims on an unprecedented scale during these peak years. Monthly elimination ceremonies became routine events that surviving community members anticipated with religious fervor, viewing each sacrifice as confirmation of their community's exceptional spiritual status. The regular influx of new converts provided fresh blood to maintain community population while supplying the steady stream of victims necessary to fund the operation's expansion. Jeremiah's development as the family's chief logistics coordinator revealed a terrifying evolution from calculating teenager to systematic killer. Now 22 years old, he had assumed responsibility for all technical aspects of victim processing, from the initial psychological evaluation through final disposal of remains. His innovations in efficiency and concealment allowed the family to eliminate multiple victims per ceremony while maintaining the sacred atmosphere that kept surviving members committed to their beliefs. The construction of additional processing facilities beneath the temple demonstrated Jeremiah's engineering capabilities and his father's ambition for expansion. These underground chambers included specialized areas for different stages of victim preparation, storage facilities for valuable items recovered from the dead, and workshops where human remains were processed into products that generated income through sales to unsuspecting buyers throughout the region. Prudence's role evolved from innocent participant to active recruiter as she reached 18 and demonstrated complete loyalty to the family's practices. Her beauty and apparent sincerity made her particularly effective at convincing hesitant prospects to join the community, as potential victims found it impossible to suspect sinister motives from such a sweet and devout young woman. Her personal testimonials about the spiritual fulfillment she had found at New Eden proved more persuasive than any theological arguments. The family's financial success during this period reflected the scale of their operations and the value of assets seized from victims. Bank records from this era, discovered decades later during a federal investigation, revealed regular deposits totaling thousands of dollars from sales of processed human remains, precious metals recovered from victims, and property transfers executed through forged documents. These funds supported not only the community's operations but also the Willowbrook family's increasingly luxurious lifestyle. The autumn equinox ceremony of 1914 demonstrated the peak efficiency of their killing system when 14 victims were processed in a single evening. The event was presented to surviving community members as the most sacred ceremony in New Eden's history, a mass ascension that would elevate multiple souls simultaneously while demonstrating God's particular favor toward their community. The elaborate preparations and extended ritual duration created an atmosphere of profound spiritual significance that masked the industrial-scale murder taking place. Community members who witnessed this mass sacrifice reported experiencing what they described as divine visions and supernatural phenomena, psychological effects that Ezekiel had learned to induce through careful manipulation of group dynamics, sensory deprivation, and chemical substances derived from local plants. These experiences reinforced their belief that they were participating in genuine miracles rather than elaborate psychological manipulation designed to conceal systematic murder. The disposal of 14 bodies in a single night required logistical coordination that showcased Jeremiah's organizational skills and the family's commitment to maintaining their facade of legitimacy. Multiple teams of community members worked through the night processing remains according to established procedures, with each group believing they were handling sacred relics that would bring blessings to the community rather than recognizing they were accomplices in covering up mass murder. By early 1915, the New Eden Covenant had eliminated over 200 individuals while maintaining its reputation as a thriving spiritual community that attracted visitors from across the country. Religious publications featured glowing articles about their agricultural success and innovative communal living arrangements, written by journalists who were carefully guided through sanitized tours that revealed nothing of the horrific reality behind the community's prosperity. The Willowbrook family's expanding operations inevitably attracted unwanted attention from outside authorities, forcing them to develop increasingly sophisticated methods for eliminating threats and maintaining their facade of legitimacy. The first serious challenge came in March 1915, when Deputy Sheriff Robert Hayes of Jackson County began investigating reports of missing persons who had last been seen traveling toward the New Eden Covenant. Hayes had received multiple inquiries from concerned relatives who had lost contact with family members after they joined the religious community. The deputy's initial investigation revealed a disturbing pattern of families who had sold their property, withdrawn their savings, and severed all outside connections before disappearing into the Oregon wilderness. His preliminary report to the county sheriff expressed concern about potential fraud or kidnapping activities at the isolated community. Ezekiel learned of Hayes's investigation through corrupted postal workers who intercepted official correspondence and reported its contents to the community for substantial payments. This early warning system allowed the family to prepare countermeasures before the deputy could gather sufficient evidence to justify a formal investigation. The response they developed would establish the template for handling all future threats from law enforcement. Sister Martha personally traveled to Jackson County to meet with Deputy Hayes, presenting herself as a concerned community leader eager to cooperate with his investigation. Her demeanor of maternal worry and religious sincerity immediately disarmed the suspicious deputy, who found it impossible to suspect evil motives from such a devout and apparently caring woman. She provided detailed explanations for each missing person inquiry, complete with forged letters and fabricated documentation that supported the community's official narrative. The case of the Morrison family, whose relatives had contacted Hayes after months of silence, exemplified Sister Martha's talent for deception. She produced letters supposedly written by family patriarch James Morrison, describing his successful establishment of a sister community in Northern California and his gratitude for the spiritual training he had received at New Eden. The handwriting matched samples that relatives provided to Hayes, though investigators would later discover that Jeremiah had spent months perfecting the forgeries. Additional evidence supporting the community's legitimacy came from carefully coached testimony by surviving members who accompanied Sister Martha to her meeting with Deputy Hayes. These witnesses spoke eloquently about the spiritual transformation they had experienced at New Eden and the voluntary nature of all departures from the community. Their genuine conviction made their lies particularly compelling, as they truly believed the narrative they had been conditioned to accept. Deputy Hayes concluded his investigation without filing charges, though he privately maintained suspicions about the community's activities. His final report noted the lack of concrete evidence supporting the missing person claims and recommended that concerned relatives contact their family members directly rather than relying on third-party reports. This official dismissal of the investigation provided the Willowbrook family with valuable protection against future law enforcement inquiries. The success in neutralizing the Hayes investigation convinced Ezekiel that corruption of local officials represented a more reliable security strategy than simply avoiding detection. Throughout 1915 and 1916, the family systematically identified and cultivated relationships with key law enforcement personnel, judges, and government administrators who could be influenced through bribery, blackmail, or religious manipulation. Sheriff William Patterson of Jackson County became their most valuable asset after Sister Martha discovered his gambling debts and drinking problems during a carefully orchestrated social encounter. Patterson's financial desperation made him receptive to the generous donations that the New Eden Covenant began making to various county projects, donations that always included substantial personal payments to ensure the sheriff's continued cooperation and discretion. Judge Theodore Blackwood proved susceptible to different pressures after Jeremiah documented the magistrate's visits to Portland brothels during supposedly official business trips. The compromising photographs and detailed records that the young man compiled provided leverage that ensured favorable treatment in any legal proceedings that might affect the community's interests. Blackwood's subsequent rulings consistently favored New Eden in property disputes and licensing matters. The elimination of potential witnesses became a routine security measure as the family's paranoia increased with their success. Community members who displayed signs of doubt or asked inconvenient questions found themselves selected for special spiritual advancement with increasing frequency. These eliminations were always presented as divine honors, but surviving members gradually learned to suppress their curiosity and avoid behaviors that might attract unwanted attention from the leadership. Martha Kellerman, a 43-year-old widow who had joined the community in 1914, became the first internal threat requiring elimination when she began questioning the discrepancies between official explanations for member departures and evidence she had observed firsthand. Her nursing background had given her medical knowledge that allowed her to recognize signs of violence in the Sacred Grove area, despite the careful cleanup procedures that followed each ceremony. Kellerman's elimination required special planning because her suspicions had made her cautious about participating in normal community activities. Jeremiah developed a strategy that exploited her maternal instincts by staging a medical emergency involving one of the community's children. When Kellerman responded to provide nursing care, she was overpowered and transported to the Sacred Grove for immediate sacrifice before she could share her suspicions with other community members. The psychological impact of Kellerman's sudden disappearance sent a clear message to other community members about the consequences of asking too many questions. Her elimination was explained as a divine calling to provide medical assistance to suffering souls in a distant location, but the timing and circumstances created an atmosphere of fear that effectively discouraged further investigation by surviving members. Security measures implemented during this period included the establishment of rotating guard duties that monitored all community entrances and communication with the outside world. These guards were presented as protection against hostile outsiders who might threaten the community's peaceful religious practices, but their actual function was surveillance and control of community members who might attempt to escape or contact authorities. The installation of hidden listening devices in community meeting areas allowed the family to monitor private conversations and identify potential threats before they could develop into serious challenges. Jeremiah's technical skills proved invaluable in creating these surveillance systems using equipment purchased through intermediaries to avoid creating traceable connections to the community. By late 1916, the Willowbrook family had successfully neutralized immediate threats to their operations while establishing security systems that would protect them for years to come. Their network of corrupted officials provided early warning of investigations, while their internal surveillance prevented community members from organizing resistance or gathering evidence that could expose the truth about New Eden's activities. The year 1917 brought the first serious external threat to the Willowbrook family's operations when investigative journalist Margaret Thornfield began researching religious communities in the Pacific Northwest for a series of articles about alternative spiritual movements. Thornfield's investigation would eventually expose cracks in the carefully constructed facade that had protected New Eden for nearly a decade, setting in motion the events that would ultimately bring down the entire operation. Thornfield's interest in the New Eden Covenant was initially sparked by inconsistencies she noticed while researching another religious community in Washington state. Multiple sources had mentioned New Eden as an example of successful communal living, but her attempts to verify basic facts about the community produced conflicting information that raised immediate red flags. Official records showed property ownership and business licenses, but personal testimonials and visitor accounts seemed suspiciously uniform in their praise. Her preliminary investigation revealed that none of the religious publications that had featured glowing articles about New Eden had actually sent reporters to visit the community. Instead, all articles were based on written materials provided by Sister Martha, who had cultivated relationships with editors through generous donations and carefully crafted correspondence. This discovery prompted Thornfield to dig deeper into the community's actual practices and membership records. The journalist's first breakthrough came when she located Emma Rodriguez, a former New Eden member who had escaped during the winter of 1916 after witnessing activities that convinced her the community was far from the peaceful religious retreat it claimed to be. Rodriguez had fled on foot through the Oregon wilderness, sustaining severe frostbite and injuries that left her hospitalized for weeks before she was able to tell authorities about her experiences. Rodriguez's testimony provided the first detailed eyewitness account of the systematic murders taking place at New Eden, though her descriptions were so horrific that local authorities had dismissed them as the delusional ravings of a traumatized woman. Sheriff Patterson had filed a report classifying her statements as mental health episodes requiring medical treatment rather than criminal allegations warranting investigation, effectively burying her testimony in bureaucratic silence. Thornfield recognized the credibility of Rodriguez's account when she cross-referenced the woman's descriptions with missing person reports from the region. The details Rodriguez provided about specific individuals and their circumstances matched perfectly with families who had disappeared after joining New Eden, creating a pattern that confirmed her worst suspicions about the community's true nature. If you're as shocked as we are by how a journalist's investigation finally began to expose this horror, you understand why supporting independent media is so crucial. These stories of institutional failure and official cover-ups remind us that truth often emerges only through the persistence of individuals willing to challenge authority. Hit that like button if you believe these historical lessons remain relevant today, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our investigations into America's hidden past. The journalist's attempts to visit New Eden directly were repeatedly thwarted by Sister Martha, who claimed that the community was observing periods of spiritual retreat that prevented them from receiving outside visitors. These delays gave the Willowbrook family time to prepare countermeasures while gathering intelligence about Thornfield's investigation through their network of corrupted officials and sympathetic contacts in the newspaper industry. Jeremiah took personal responsibility for neutralizing the Thornfield threat, utilizing surveillance techniques he had developed for monitoring community members to track the journalist's movements and identify her sources of information. His investigation revealed that she had been corresponding with relatives of missing New Eden members and gathering documentation that could potentially expose the family's operations to federal scrutiny. The decision to eliminate Thornfield required careful planning because her disappearance would inevitably trigger a high-profile investigation that could attract unwanted attention from state and federal authorities. Jeremiah developed a strategy that would make her death appear to be an accident while simultaneously discrediting her research through the destruction of her investigative materials and corruption of her sources. The plan was implemented in November 1917, when Thornfield was traveling to interview Rodriguez for a follow-up article that would have provided additional corroborating evidence. Jeremiah had learned about this meeting through intercepted correspondence and arranged for the journalist's automobile to suffer brake failure on a mountain road known for dangerous curves and steep drop-offs. The staged accident was executed with precision that reflected Jeremiah's mechanical skills and understanding of forensic investigation techniques. Thornfield's death was ruled accidental by corrupt local officials, while her research materials were destroyed in a convenient fire that consumed her hotel room shortly after the crash. Emma Rodriguez, traumatized by the loss of the only person who had believed her testimony, retreated into silence and never again spoke publicly about her experiences at New Eden. The elimination of Thornfield and the destruction of her research bought the Willowbrook family several more years of security, but it also marked the beginning of their operational decline. The resources required to manage increasingly complex security threats diverted attention from victim recruitment and processing, while the stress of constant vigilance began to affect the family's psychological stability and decision-making capabilities. Community morale also began to suffer as surviving members sensed the growing tension and paranoia among their leaders. The atmosphere of spiritual celebration that had characterized earlier years gradually gave way to suspicion and fear, as members learned that even minor expressions of doubt could result in sudden selection for spiritual advancement. This change in community dynamics reduced the effectiveness of the psychological conditioning that had previously ensured member loyalty and cooperation. The investigation that Thornfield had begun continued through other channels as her editor, James Morrison, refused to accept the official explanation for her death. Morrison had worked with Thornfield for over 15 years and knew her to be an exceptionally careful driver who maintained her automobile in perfect condition. His private investigation into the circumstances of her death uncovered evidence of tampering that convinced him she had been murdered to silence her research. Morrison's subsequent efforts to continue Thornfield's investigation proved more cautious and methodical than her direct approach had been. Rather than attempting to visit New Eden or contact community members directly, he focused on building relationships with law enforcement officials who were not part of the corrupted network that protected the Willowbrook family. His patient approach would eventually bear fruit as honest investigators began to take notice of the accumulating evidence. Dr. Harrison Fletcher, a psychiatrist who had treated Emma Rodriguez during her recovery, became Morrison's most valuable ally when the editor convinced him to review Rodriguez's testimony with fresh perspective. Fletcher's professional analysis of her statements revealed consistent details and psychological indicators that supported her credibility rather than suggesting mental illness. His willingness to stake his professional reputation on Rodriguez's truthfulness provided the foundation for renewed official interest in investigating New Eden's activities. By early 1918, a small but determined group of investigators was quietly gathering evidence that would eventually expose the truth about the New Eden Covenant. The network of corruption that had protected the Willowbrook family for years remained intact, but cracks were beginning to appear in their security as honest officials started asking questions that could not be easily deflected or suppressed. Federal agent Daniel Blackwood's assignment to investigate religious communities suspected of mail fraud in early 1918 would prove to be the beginning of the end for the Willowbrook family's decade-long reign of terror. Blackwood, ironically the nephew of the corrupted Judge Theodore Blackwood, possessed both the investigative skills and federal authority necessary to penetrate the network of local protection that had shielded New Eden from previous scrutiny. Unlike local investigators who could be bought or intimidated, Blackwood operated under federal jurisdiction with resources that extended far beyond the Pacific Northwest. His investigation began with financial irregularities that the Postal Service had identified in correspondence between New Eden and potential recruits, irregularities that suggested systematic fraud involving property transfers and inheritance claims from deceased community members. The agent's methodical approach to evidence gathering revealed patterns that local authorities had either missed or deliberately ignored. Bank records from multiple states showed suspicious transactions involving property sales by New Eden members, with proceeds consistently flowing into accounts controlled by the Willowbrook family rather than the individuals who had supposedly initiated the sales. These financial trails provided concrete evidence of criminal activity that could not be dismissed as religious persecution. Blackwood's interviews with relatives of missing New Eden members uncovered disturbing consistencies in the circumstances surrounding each disappearance. Family after family reported identical patterns of sudden communication cessation, forged farewell letters, and property transfers that occurred after their relatives had supposedly departed for distant missions. The agent's documentation of these testimonials created a compelling case for systematic criminal conspiracy. The breakthrough in Blackwood's investigation came when he located Thomas Brennan, the adult son of elderly widow Sarah Brennan who had joined New Eden in 1908. Thomas had been searching for his mother for nearly 10 years, following leads across multiple states based on letters he had received claiming she was establishing religious communities in various locations. His persistence had uncovered discrepancies in postmarks, handwriting analysis, and travel logistics that suggested systematic deception. Thomas Brennan's documentation proved invaluable to the federal investigation, as he had preserved every piece of correspondence allegedly sent by his mother along with detailed notes about inconsistencies he had observed. His amateur detective work had identified the same patterns that Blackwood was uncovering through official channels, providing independent verification of the agent's suspicions about New Eden's activities. The agent's attempts to conduct surveillance of the New Eden community were initially frustrated by the remote location and sophisticated security measures that the Willowbrook family had implemented. However, his federal resources allowed him to establish observation posts on adjacent federal land, where agents could monitor community activities without alerting the family to the investigation's scope and seriousness. Surveillance photographs taken during the autumn equinox ceremony of 1918 provided the first visual evidence of the ritualistic murders taking place at New Eden. Though the images were taken from too great a distance to show specific details, they clearly documented large gatherings in the sacred grove during nighttime hours, followed by systematic burial activities that contradicted the community's claims about member departures for distant locations. The decision to recruit Emma Rodriguez as a federal witness required delicate negotiations, as the traumatized woman had retreated into complete silence following Margaret Thornfield's suspicious death. Dr. Harrison Fletcher's psychological evaluation indicated that Rodriguez possessed crucial information about New Eden's operations, but her cooperation would require careful protection and extensive psychological support to overcome her terror of retaliation. Blackwood's promise of federal protection and relocation convinced Rodriguez to provide detailed testimony about the systematic murders she had witnessed during her time at New Eden. Her descriptions of the sacred grove ceremonies, victim selection processes, and disposal methods provided investigators with specific information that could guide their evidence collection efforts and support criminal charges against the Willowbrook family. The agent's investigation revealed that the family's corruption network extended beyond local officials to include federal postal workers, bank managers, and even some state-level politicians who had received substantial donations from New Eden's charitable foundation. This discovery necessitated extreme secrecy in the investigation's later stages, as the team could not be certain which officials might alert the Willowbrook family to their activities. Physical evidence collection required innovative techniques due to the community's remote location and sophisticated security measures. Blackwood coordinated with Forest Service personnel to conduct seemingly routine soil surveys that allowed investigators to collect samples from areas surrounding the sacred grove, samples that later testing would reveal contained human remains and trace evidence of systematic burial activities. The most damaging evidence emerged when investigators discovered Jeremiah Willowbrook's detailed journals during a covert search of community buildings. These documents, written in a coded system that federal cryptographers eventually deciphered, contained meticulous records of every murder committed at New Eden, including victim names, dates, methods of elimination, and disposal procedures. The journals represented a complete confession that would prove invaluable in securing convictions. Analysis of the journals revealed the true scope of the Willowbrook family's crimes, documenting 247 confirmed murders between 1908 and 1918, with detailed financial records showing the profits generated from each victim's assets and processed remains. The systematic nature of the documentation demonstrated that the killings were carefully planned business operations rather than random acts of violence or religious fanaticism. The investigation team's discovery of the underground processing facilities beneath the temple provided physical evidence that corroborated the journal entries and witness testimony. These chambers contained equipment for dismembering bodies, storage areas for valuable items recovered from victims, and workshops where human remains were processed into products for sale. The facilities represented an industrial-scale operation that had functioned for over a decade. Forensic analysis of the processing equipment revealed trace evidence from dozens of victims, including blood residue, bone fragments, and personal items that could be matched to specific missing persons. This physical evidence provided irrefutable proof of the murders and demonstrated the systematic nature of the family's operations, supporting federal charges that would carry severe penalties, including potential death sentences. By late 1918, Agent Blackwood had assembled a comprehensive case against the Willowbrook family that included financial evidence, witness testimony, physical evidence, and documentary proof of their crimes. The investigation had taken nearly a year to complete, but the resulting evidence package was so thorough and compelling that conviction seemed virtually certain once arrests were made. The timing of the arrests would prove crucial, as the family's growing paranoia and recent security breaches had convinced Ezekiel that the community might need to be abandoned or dramatically restructured to avoid detection. Blackwood's team recognized that any delay in taking action might allow the family to escape justice or eliminate remaining witnesses who could testify against them. The Willowbrook family's carefully constructed world began to collapse on December 15, 1918, when federal agents surrounded the New Eden Covenant in a coordinated raid designed to prevent escape and preserve evidence. Agent Blackwood had planned the operation for months, timing it to coincide with the winter solstice ceremony when the entire community would be gathered in the sacred grove, making it impossible for the family to eliminate witnesses or destroy crucial evidence. Ezekiel's first indication that their security had been compromised came when lookouts posted at the community's perimeter failed to report their scheduled checkings during the early morning hours. His attempts to contact corrupted Sheriff Patterson revealed that the local official had been arrested hours earlier on federal charges, eliminating the family's primary source of law enforcement protection and early warning intelligence. The systematic nature of the federal operation became apparent as agents simultaneously raided the homes of corrupted officials, recruitment network members, and financial intermediaries who had supported the family's operations. This coordinated approach prevented any single arrest from alerting other conspirators, ensuring that the entire criminal enterprise would be dismantled rather than allowing key participants to escape or destroy evidence. Sister Martha's attempts to maintain the community's facade of innocence proved futile when confronted with Agent Blackwood's comprehensive evidence package. The federal investigator presented her with Jeremiah's journals, forensic evidence from the processing facilities, and testimony from Emma Rodriguez that detailed her personal involvement in victim preparation and disposal. Her maternal persona crumbled as she realized the hopelessness of their situation. Jeremiah's response to the federal raid revealed the calculating intelligence that had made him such an effective architect of the family's killing system. Rather than attempting to deny his involvement or maintain the religious facade, he immediately began negotiating for reduced charges in exchange for cooperation with the investigation. His detailed knowledge of the operation's logistics and financial networks made him a valuable asset for prosecutors seeking to recover stolen assets and identify additional victims. The discovery of community members who had been scheduled for elimination during the winter solstice ceremony provided dramatic evidence of the family's ongoing murderous intent. 12 individuals, including 3 children, had been selected for sacrifice and were found bound and drugged in the temple's basement chambers when federal agents breached the building. Their rescue represented the first time in over a decade that selected victims had survived the family's elimination process. Prudence's arrest proved particularly disturbing to investigators who struggled to reconcile her youthful appearance and apparent innocence with the extensive evidence of her participation in systematic murder. Her complete psychological integration into the family's practices had created a young woman who expressed genuine confusion about why authorities were treating their religious ceremonies as criminal activities rather than sacred spiritual practices. The community's surviving members displayed a range of responses to the federal raid that reflected the varying degrees of psychological conditioning they had experienced. Long-term residents who had witnessed multiple sacrifice ceremonies showed signs of severe dissociation and trauma, while newer arrivals seemed relieved to learn the truth about activities they had found increasingly disturbing but hadn't dared to question. Agent Blackwood's interrogation of Ezekiel revealed the theological justifications that had allowed the charismatic leader to maintain his self-image as a divine instrument rather than a common murderer. Even when confronted with overwhelming evidence of his crimes, Ezekiel continued to insist that the sacrifices had been necessary spiritual practices that elevated victims to higher planes of existence while protecting the world from their corrupting influence. The scale of evidence recovered during the raid exceeded investigators' expectations and provided insights into criminal operations that had remained hidden for over a decade. Financial records revealed that the family had generated over $200,000 in profit from their victims' assets, while detailed victim logs documented the systematic murder of 284 individuals between 1908 and 1918. Federal efforts to locate and recover stolen assets led to discoveries that extended the investigation far beyond the Oregon community. Bank accounts in multiple states contained funds traced to victim property sales, while warehouses in San Francisco and Portland held inventory that forensic analysis revealed had been manufactured from processed human remains. The scope of the commercial operation shocked even experienced federal investigators. The arrest of recruitment network members in major cities revealed how the family had systematically targeted vulnerable populations for over a decade. Portland agent Rebecca Morrison's boarding house records contained detailed profiles of hundreds of potential victims, while Seattle operative Jacob Steiner's immigration assistance files showed how the family had exploited desperate European families seeking better lives in America. Community members who had served as unwitting accomplices in victim processing faced difficult decisions about cooperation with federal prosecutors. Many had genuinely believed they were participating in sacred religious practices, making their testimony crucial for understanding how the family had maintained community loyalty while committing systematic murder. Their cooperation would prove essential for securing convictions against the primary perpetrators. The psychological impact of the raid on surviving community members required extensive support from federal social workers and mental health professionals. Many individuals had spent years believing they were part of a blessed spiritual community, only to discover they had been accessories to mass murder. The process of helping them understand and cope with this reality would take months of intensive therapy and support. Dr. Harrison Fletcher's evaluation of the community's children revealed the long-term damage caused by their exposure to the family's practices. Several children displayed symptoms of severe psychological trauma, while others showed disturbing signs of having internalized the violent ideology that had justified the murders they had witnessed. Their rehabilitation would require years of specialized treatment and careful monitoring. The discovery of detailed architectural plans for expanded killing facilities revealed that the Willowbrook family had been planning to dramatically increase their operations rather than winding them down. These documents showed designs for larger processing chambers, improved disposal systems, and expanded recruitment capabilities that would have allowed them to murder hundreds of additional victims if their activities had remained undetected. Agent Blackwood's final report on the New Eden investigation documented what federal authorities classified as one of the most systematic and prolonged mass murder operations in American history. The family's ability to maintain their facade of religious legitimacy while killing nearly 300 people demonstrated the dangerous potential of isolated religious communities that operated without effective oversight or accountability to outside authorities.